It was supposed to be a routine drive home, just me and the open road stretching out before me. But then my car decided to break down in the middle of nowhere, leaving me stranded on a desolate stretch of highway with no one around for miles. At first, I tried to remain calm, telling myself that help would come soon. But as the hours passed and night began to fall, a sense of unease settled over me like a heavy blanket. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that there was someone out there in the darkness, just beyond the reach of my headlights. I peered out into the night, straining my eyes for any sign of movement, but all I could see was the empty expanse of the highway stretching out before me. It was as if the world had become still, frozen in time, with only the sound of the wind whispering through the trees to keep me company. But then I heard it, a soft rustling sound coming from the trees lining the side of the road. My heart began to race as I realized that I was now alone out here in the darkness, that there was someone, or something, out there watching me. I fumbled for my phone, desperate for some kind of connection to the outside world, but the screen remained dark, mocking me with its silence. Panic began to rise in my chest as I realized just how truly alone I was out here in the middle of nowhere. I considered getting out of the car and trying to flag down passing motorists, but the thought of stepping out into the darkness, vulnerable and exposed, sent a shiver down my spine. So instead, I huddled down in my seat, praying for daylight to come and chase away the shadows. But then I heard it again, the sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel outside my car. I held my breath, straining to listen for any clue as to who or what was out there, but all I could hear was the pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears. I reached for the door handle, ready to make a run for it, but before I could even touch it, the footsteps stopped right outside my window. I froze, paralyzed with fear, as I waited for whatever was out there to make its next move. And then, suddenly, there was a knock, 3 sharp raps on the window that echoed through the silence like gunshots. I recoiled, shrinking back into my seat as I stared wide-eyed at the shadowy figure standing outside. For a moment, we just stared at each other, locked in a silent standoff as the darkness pressed in around us. And then, without warning, the figure turned and disappeared back into the night, leaving me alone once again with nothing but my fear for company. I sat there for what felt like hours, too terrified to move, too afraid to even breathe. But eventually, the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, casting long shadows across the empty highway. With trembling hands, I reached for the ignition, praying that my car would start and carry me far away from this nightmare. And to my relief, the engine sputtered to life, roaring to life like a beast awakened from its slumber. I wasted no time in putting the car into gear and speeding away from that desolate stretch of highway, leaving behind the darkness and the fear that had haunted me through the long night. I was out in the wilderness, deep in the heart of the forest, feeling the thrill of adventure coursing through my veins. I had strayed off the beaten path, eager to explore uncharted territory and discover hidden treasures that few others had ever laid eyes on. But as the day wore on and the sun dipped below the horizon, I realized I had made a grave mistake. I was hopelessly lost, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to stretch on endlessly in every direction. Panic gripped me as I realized the gravity of my situation. I had no map, no compass, and no idea which way to turn. The forest loomed ominously around me, its shadows growing darker with each passing moment. I stumbled through the underbrush, my heart pounding in my chest, desperately searching for any sign of civilization. But the forest was silent, save for the rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig beneath my feet. It was as if the wilderness itself had swallowed me whole, leaving me to fend for myself in its unforgiving embrace. As the darkness deepened, I began to hear voices echoing through the trees. At first, I thought it was my imagination playing tricks on me, but as I listened closer, I realized the voices were real. They were harsh and guttural, filled with anger and hostility. Fear washed over me as I realized I was not alone. Someone, or something, was out there in the darkness, watching me with hostile intent. I tried to move quietly, to slip away unnoticed, but every step I took seemed to echo through the forest, betraying my presence to whoever, or whatever, was out there. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, I stumbled upon them, a group of locals, their faces twisted in anger as they glared at me from the shadows. They were armed with makeshift weapons, clubs, knives, even firearms, and they didn't look happy to see me. I tried to explain that I was lost, that I meant no harm, but my words fell on deaf ears. The locals advanced on me, their expressions growing more menacing with each passing moment. I knew I was in trouble, that I was facing a fight for my life. Adrenaline surged through me as I braced myself for the inevitable confrontation. I knew I had to defend myself, to do whatever it took to survive. With trembling hands, I reached for a nearby branch, ready to use it as a makeshift weapon. But before the locals could reach me, something strange happened. A loud noise echoed through the forest, causing them to freeze in their tracks. I looked up, my heart pounding in my chest, to see a group of park rangers emerging from the trees. Relief flooded through me as I realized I was saved. The rangers quickly intervened, defusing the situation before it could escalate any further. They escorted me back to safety, their presence a welcome sight after the terror of the night. As we made our way out of the forest, I couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if they hadn't arrived when they did. I shuddered to think of the fate that awaited me at the hands of those hostile locals, and I silently thanked whatever powers that be for guiding the rangers to my rescue. As we emerged from the forest, back into the safety of civilization, I made a solemn vow to never venture off the beaten path again. The wilderness may hold untold wonders, but it also hides unspeakable dangers, dangers that I had come far too close to experiencing firsthand. From now on, I would stick to the well-trodden trails, content to leave the mysteries of the forest to those more daring or foolish than myself. I've always enjoyed hiking, so when I stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin deep in the woods during one of my solo trips, I was intrigued. The cabin looked like it had been abandoned for years, with its windows boarded up and its door hanging off its hinges. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to explore the decrepit structure. As I stepped inside, a chill ran down my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The interior of the cabin was just as eerie as the exterior. The air was thick with dust, and the floorboards creaked underfoot as I made my way through the dimly lit rooms. I stumbled upon a small bedroom tucked away in the back of the cabin. The bed was unmade, with sheets that looked like they hadn't been changed in years. But what really caught my attention was the blood-stained mattress. My heart began to race as I realized that this cabin held secrets, dark and sinister secrets that I wasn't sure I wanted to uncover. But I couldn't tear myself away. I had to know more. I continued to search the cabin, my footsteps echoing through the empty rooms. It felt like the walls were closing in around me, suffocating me with their silence. And then, just as I was about to give up hope of finding anything of interest, I stumbled upon a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. My hand shook as I pried open the lid, revealing a stash of old photographs. The photographs were faded and yellowed with age, but what they depicted sent a shiver down my spine. They showed scenes of violence and depravity, people bound and gagged, their eyes wide with fear. I felt sick to my stomach as I realized that this cabin had been the scene of unspeakable horrors. But as I turned to leave, I heard a noise, a soft, rasping breath that sent a chill down my spine. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, as I realized that I was now alone in the cabin. Someone, or something, was lurking in the shadows, watching me with hungry eyes. I tried to remain calm as I made my way towards the door, but every creak of the floorboards seemed to echo through the silence like a gunshot. I could feel the presence of whoever, or whatever, was in the cabin with me, closing in on me with every step. And then, just as I reached the door, I heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My blood ran cold as I realized that I was trapped, with no way out and no one to help me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out as I felt something brush against my skin, something cold and clammy that sent shivers down my spine. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the presence was gone, leaving me alone in the darkness once again. I wasted no time in fleeing the cabin, running as fast as my legs could carry me through the woods. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of my car, where I collapsed in a heap, shaking with fear and exhaustion. It was only then, as I sat in the safety of my car, that I allowed myself to truly process what had happened. I had stumbled upon something dark and sinister in that abandoned cabin, something that I never wanted to encounter again. I was driving down a long stretch of highway, the only car for miles around. My gas gauge was hovering dangerously close to empty, so when I spotted a rundown gas station up ahead, I breathed a sigh of relief. Pulling into the gravel lot, I parked my car next to the lone pump and stepped out into the chilly night air. The gas station looked like something straight out of a horror movie, dimly lit, with peeling paint and broken windows. But beggars can't be choosers, so I grabbed the fuel nozzle and began to fill up my tank. As I did, I glanced around, taking in my surroundings. That's when I noticed him, the cashier, standing behind the counter, watching me with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. There was something off about him, something not quite right. His eyes were dark and sunken, his face pale and gaunt. But it was more than just his appearance that unnerved me. It was the way he seemed to be studying me, as if trying to peer into my soul. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease as I finished filling up my tank and headed into the convenience store to pay. The bell above the door jingled softly as I entered, and I glanced around, taking in the rows of dusty shelves lined with long-expired snacks and drinks. The cashier was standing behind the counter, his expression unreadable as he watched me approach. I forced a smile and reached into my pocket for my wallet, but as I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. I handed him a $20 bill and waited for my change, but instead of taking the money, he just stared at me, his eyes boring into mine. I shifted uncomfortably, wondering what was going on, when suddenly, he spoke. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "This place is cursed." I blinked in surprise, unsure of how to respond. Was he serious? Or was this some kind of sick joke? Before I could say anything, he continued. "Bad things happen to people who come here," he said, his voice growing more urgent. "You need to leave, before it's too late." I felt a chill run down my spine as his words sank in. What did he mean, bad things? And why was he so insistent that I leave? I glanced around nervously, suddenly aware of how isolated we were out here in the middle of nowhere. But before I could gather my thoughts, the door to the convenience store burst open, and a group of rough-looking men stumbled inside. They were laughing and joking loudly, their voices echoing off the walls. I tensed instinctively, my heart pounding in my chest as I watched them approach the counter. The cashier's expression hardened as they drew near, and I could sense the tension in the air. "Hey, old man," one of the men said, his voice slurred with alcohol. "We need some smokes." The cashier didn't respond, just stared at them with cold, empty eyes. The atmosphere in the convenience store grew more tense by the second, until it felt like a powder keg ready to explode. And then, without warning, chaos erupted. The men lunged at the cashier, knocking over shelves and sending products flying. I stumbled backwards, my heart racing as I watched the violence unfold before my eyes. I knew I had to get out of there, and fast. But as I turned to flee, I felt a hand close around my wrist, pulling me back. I spun around, my eyes widening in horror as I came face to face with the cashier. "Run," he said, his voice urgent. "Run as fast as you can, and don't look back." I didn't need to be told twice. I wrenched my wrist free from his grip and bolted for the door, my heart pounding in my chest as I sprinted out into the night. Behind me, I could hear the sounds of the struggle intensifying, the men's shouts and the cashier's cries blending together into a cacophony of chaos. But I didn't dare look back. I just kept running, my legs pumping as fast as they could go, until I was safely back in my car, the engine roaring to life beneath me. I peeled out of the gas station parking lot, my heart still racing as I sped away into the night. It was only when I was miles away, the gas station nothing but a distant memory in my rearview mirror, that I allowed myself to breathe a sigh of relief. I was driving alone in the dead of night. It was the kind of stretch of highway that seemed to go on forever, with no signs of life in any direction. Suddenly, out of the darkness, I saw him, a lone figure standing on the side of the road, his thumb outstretched in a silent plea for a ride. Without really thinking, I slowed down and pulled over, rolling down the window to ask if he needed a lift. He approached the car cautiously, his eyes darting around as if searching for something. There was something about him that made me uneasy, but I brushed it off as nerves and unlocked the passenger door, inviting him to hop in. As soon as he settled into the seat beside me, I regretted my decision. There was something off about him, something that sent a shiver down my spine. His eyes were cold and calculating, his movements jerky and unpredictable. I tried to make small talk, to ease the tension that hung heavy in the air, but he was strangely silent. He just sat there, staring straight ahead, his expression unreadable. As the miles passed, I became increasingly unnerved by his presence. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong, that I had made a grave mistake by picking him up. I glanced over at him, trying to gauge his intentions, but his gaze remained fixed on the road ahead. It was as if he was waiting for something, biding his time until the moment was right. Suddenly, he spoke, his voice low and menacing. He asked me to pull over, claiming he needed to use the bathroom. But something in his tone sent alarm bells ringing in my head, and I knew I couldn't trust him. I tried to refuse, to come up with some excuse to keep driving, but he insisted, growing more agitated by the second. Panic surged through me as I realized I was alone in the car with a stranger who meant me harm. With trembling hands, I reached for my phone, my fingers fumbling over the buttons as I tried to dial 911. But before I could make the call, he lunged at me, grabbing the phone from my grasp and throwing it out the window. I screamed, the sound echoing through the empty night as I fought against him, desperate to escape his grasp. But he was too strong, overpowering me with ease as he pinned me against the seat, his hands closing around my throat. I struggled to breathe, my vision swimming as darkness closed in around me. But just when I thought I couldn't hold on any longer, I heard the sound of approaching headlights, and the stranger released his grip, disappearing into the night as quickly as he had come. I slumped against the seat, gasping for air as the car pulled to a stop beside me. It was a passing motorist who had seen the struggle and stopped to help. They called the police, who arrived moments later to take my statement and search for the attacker. I was shaken but alive, grateful to have escaped with my life. I was hitchhiking through the countryside, hoping to catch a ride to the next town. It was getting late, and I was starting to worry about finding a place to sleep for the night when a car pulled up beside me. The driver was a friendly-looking guy, with a warm smile and an easy manner. He offered me a ride, and I gratefully accepted, climbing into the passenger seat beside him. As we drove deeper into the wilderness, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The road was deserted, with no other cars in sight, and the trees loomed ominously overhead. I tried to shake off my unease, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. But as we continued on our journey, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone, or something, was lurking in the shadows. Suddenly, the driver took a sharp turn off the main road onto a narrow dirt track that disappeared into the trees. My heart started to race as I realized that I was in trouble. I demanded to know where he was taking me, but he just laughed and told me to relax. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end as I realized that I had been lured into a trap. I knew I had to act fast if I wanted to escape. I waited until we reached a bend in the road, and then I made my move, throwing open the door and leaping out of the car. I hit the ground running, crashing through the underbrush as I tried to put as much distance between myself and my would-be captor as possible. But he was hot on my heels, shouting curses and threats as he chased after me. I pushed myself to run faster, my lungs burning with exertion as I pushed my body to its limits. I could hear the sound of his footsteps growing closer and closer behind me, and I knew that I couldn't keep this up for much longer. Just when I thought I couldn't run anymore, I burst through the trees and stumbled out onto the road. I didn't stop running until I reached the nearest town, where I collapsed in a heap, gasping for breath and shaking with fear. It was only then that I realized how lucky I was to have escaped with my life. If I had stayed in that car for even a moment longer, who knows what would have happened to me. We were out in the middle of nowhere, just me and my friends, ready for a weekend of camping and relaxation. We found a remote spot, far away from civilization, where we could truly immerse ourselves in nature. As we set up our tents and got a fire going, everything seemed perfect. The air was crisp, the stars were shining brightly overhead, and we were all looking forward to a few days of peace and quiet. But as night fell and darkness descended upon the forest, things started to take a turn for the worse. We began to hear strange noises coming from the woods, rustling in the underbrush, snapping twigs, and low, guttural growls that sent shivers down our spines. At first, we tried to brush it off, convincing ourselves that it was just the normal sounds of the wilderness. But as the noises grew louder and closer, we couldn't ignore the feeling of unease that settled over us like a heavy blanket. We huddled together around the fire, our eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. But the shadows seemed to swallow everything up, leaving us feeling vulnerable and exposed. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the bushes nearby, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps crunching through the undergrowth. We froze, our hearts pounding in our chests as we waited for whatever was out there to reveal itself. And then, emerging from the darkness, came a figure, tall and menacing, with wild eyes and a feral grin that sent chills down our spines. It was a man, but there was something about him that seemed off. He staggered towards us, his movements unsteady and erratic, like a predator sizing up its prey. We scrambled to our feet, ready to run, but he just stood there, watching us with a hungry look in his eyes. I could feel the panic rising in my chest as I searched desperately for a way out. But no matter which direction I looked, all I could see were trees and darkness stretching out into infinity. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the man turned and disappeared back into the forest, leaving us alone once again. But the sense of dread lingered, like a dark cloud hanging over our heads, reminding us that we were not safe out here in the wilderness. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, our ears straining for any sign of danger. But aside from the occasional rustle of leaves or distant howl of a wild animal, the woods remained eerily quiet. As dawn broke and the first light of morning filtered through the trees, we wasted no time packing up our camp and getting the hell out of there. We didn't stop until we were back in the safety of civilization, far away from the remote wilderness that had almost become our tomb. Looking back on that night, I can't help but wonder what would have happened if we had stayed just a little longer. Would the man have returned, more aggressive and dangerous than before? Or would we have become just another set of bones littering the forest floor, victims of whatever lurked in the darkness? I may never know the answers to those questions, but one thing is for certain, I will never underestimate the dangers of the wilderness again. My car broke down in the middle of nowhere, leaving me stranded on an isolated stretch of highway with no other option but to seek shelter for the night. The only place around was a rundown roadside motel that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. Reluctantly, I made my way to the front desk and checked in with the tired-looking clerk. He handed me a key to one of the rooms and muttered something about keeping to myself and not causing any trouble. The room was dingy and smelled musty, with faded wallpaper peeling off the walls and a lumpy mattress that looked like it hadn't been replaced in years. But it was better than sleeping in my car, so I decided to make the best of it. As I settled in for the night, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. There was something about this place that just didn't sit right with me, something dark and sinister lurking beneath the surface. I tried to push the thoughts out of my mind and focus on getting some rest. But as I lay there in the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that there were eyes on me from every corner of the room. Suddenly, I heard a noise outside my door, a soft, shuffling sound that made my blood run cold. I held my breath, listening intently as the footsteps grew closer and closer. Then, without warning, the door burst open and a group of shadowy figures burst into the room. They were dressed in dark clothing and their faces were hidden beneath hoods, their eyes gleaming with malice in the dim light. I tried to scream, but no sound came out as they surrounded me, their hands reaching out to grab me and pull me into their midst. I struggled and fought with all my might, but they were too strong for me, overpowering me with ease. They dragged me out of the room and down a dimly lit hallway, their grip like iron around my wrists as they dragged me towards who knows what fate awaited me. I knew I had to escape, but I was trapped in this nightmare from which there seemed to be no escape. Just when I thought all hope was lost, I heard a noise from up ahead, the sound of shouting and commotion. I strained my ears, listening intently as the noise grew louder and louder. Then, suddenly, a door burst open and a group of police officers burst into the hallway, their guns drawn and their faces grim. They shouted at the figures to freeze, and I seized the opportunity to break free from their grasp and run for my life. I ran as fast as my legs could carry me, the sound of gunfire echoing in my ears as I raced down the hallway and out into the night. I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of the police cars parked outside, where I collapsed in a heap, gasping for breath and shaking with fear. It was only then that I realized how lucky I was to have escaped with my life. If it hadn't been for those police officers, I don't know what would have happened to me. But now that I was safe, all I wanted was to put this nightmare behind me and never look back. I set out on the hiking trail, confident in my skills and experience. The wilderness was familiar to me, and I relished the opportunity to explore its hidden secrets. But as I ventured deeper into the forest, I noticed something strange. The trail seemed to be fading away, disappearing into the undergrowth as if it had never existed. I stopped, feeling a twinge of unease creeping up my spine. I tried to retrace my steps, but the landscape had shifted, and I found myself hopelessly lost. Panic began to gnaw at the edges of my mind as I realized I had no idea which way to go. I stumbled through the underbrush, my heart pounding in my chest as I struggled to keep my fear at bay. But no matter which direction I turned, there was nothing but trees and darkness stretching out before me. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, I heard it, a soft rustling in the bushes behind me, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps crunching through the undergrowth. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I strained to listen. But the noises stopped as suddenly as they had begun, leaving me standing there in the silence, my heart hammering in my chest. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, but deep down, I knew better. I quickened my pace, my senses on high alert as I scanned the shadows for any sign of movement. But the forest remained eerily quiet, as if holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I saw it, a figure lurking in the shadows, watching me with eyes that glinted in the darkness. I froze, my muscles tensing as I prepared to defend myself against whatever was out there. But as the figure drew closer, I realized with a sinking feeling in my stomach that it wasn't an animal at all, it was a person. And not just any person, but someone who seemed to be stalking me with malicious intent. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest as I sprinted through the underbrush, desperate to put as much distance between myself and my pursuer as possible. But no matter how fast I ran, I could feel them closing in on me, their presence looming over me like a shadow. I stumbled and fell, my hands scraping against the rough forest floor as I struggled to pick myself back up. But before I could regain my footing, I felt a pair of hands grab hold of me, pulling me down into the darkness. I screamed, my voice echoing through the forest as I fought against my attacker with everything I had. But they were stronger than me, their grip like iron as they dragged me further and further away from the safety of the trail. And then, just when I thought all hope was lost, I saw a glimmer of light ahead, the trail, shining like a beacon in the darkness. With a burst of adrenaline-fueled energy, I broke free from my attacker's grasp and sprinted towards it, my heart pounding in my chest as I ran for my life. I stumbled out of the forest, gasping for breath as I collapsed onto the ground, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. But as I looked back into the darkness, I saw nothing, no sign of my attacker, no hint of the danger that had lurked in the shadows. I knew I had been lucky to escape with my life, but the memory of that encounter would haunt me for the rest of my days. I was out for a hike, enjoying the solitude of nature and the beauty of the wilderness. I had no idea that my peaceful excursion would soon turn into a nightmare. As I wandered deeper into the forest, I stumbled upon a clearing that seemed like the perfect spot to rest and take in the scenery. Little did I know, I had unwittingly trespassed onto the land of a territorial landowner. Before I could even realize my mistake, a gruff voice called out from behind me, demanding to know what I was doing on their property. Startled, I turned to see a rugged-looking man approaching, his expression fierce and unwelcoming. I quickly apologized, explaining that I hadn't realized I had strayed onto private land and that I would leave right away. But the landowner wasn't satisfied with my apology. He seemed intent on teaching me a lesson about respecting boundaries. As I turned to leave, I felt a sharp pain in my side as something struck me with incredible force. I cried out in pain, stumbling forward as I tried to flee from my attacker. But the landowner wasn't finished with me yet. He pursued me relentlessly, his footsteps echoing through the forest as he closed in on me with terrifying speed. I knew I had to find a way to escape, but the dense underbrush made it nearly impossible to see where I was going. Every step I took felt like wading through molasses, my legs heavy with fear and exhaustion. I glanced over my shoulder and saw the landowner gaining on me, his eyes filled with a chilling determination that sent shivers down my spine. I knew I couldn't outrun him forever. I needed to find a way to outsmart him and get to safety. With a surge of adrenaline, I veered off the trail and ducked behind a thicket of bushes, hoping to lose my pursuer in the dense foliage. I held my breath, listening intently for any sign of movement as I waited for him to pass by. But just when I thought I had evaded him, I felt a strong hand close around my ankle, dragging me out from my hiding spot with surprising strength. I screamed in terror, thrashing wildly as I tried to break free from his grasp. But the landowner held on tight, his grip like a vice as he dragged me back towards his property. I struggled and fought with everything I had, but it was no use. He was simply too strong, too determined to let me escape. As we neared the edge of the forest, I knew I was running out of options. Desperate for help, I screamed for anyone who might be nearby, praying that someone would hear my cries and come to my rescue. And then, just when it seemed like all hope was lost, I heard the sound of approaching footsteps. I turned to see a group of hikers emerging from the trees, their faces filled with concern as they rushed to my aid. With their help, I was able to break free from the landowner's grasp and flee to safety. I stumbled out of the forest, my heart pounding in my chest as I collapsed onto the ground, exhausted but grateful to be alive. As I looked back at the forest, I knew I would never forget the terror of that encounter, the fear of being hunted like an animal, the desperation of trying to escape from a predator who would stop at nothing to protect what was his. But despite the trauma of that day, I also knew that I was lucky to have survived. I was out hiking in the wilderness, exploring some new trails that I'd never been on before. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and everything seemed peaceful and serene. But then, as I rounded a bend in the trail, I stumbled upon something that sent shivers down my spine, an unmarked graveyard, hidden away in the middle of nowhere. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate further. As I wandered among the weathered headstones, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled over me. There was something about this place that just didn't feel right, something dark and sinister lurking beneath the surface. I started to read the names on the headstones, trying to piece together the story of the people buried here. But the more I learned, the more disturbed I became. It seemed that many of them had died under mysterious circumstances, accidents, disappearances, and even murders that had never been solved. As I continued to explore, I stumbled upon an old, crumbling mausoleum hidden away in the trees. The door was hanging off its hinges, and I hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The air was thick with dust and the smell of decay, and I felt a chill run down my spine as I peered into the darkness. I shone my flashlight around the interior, illuminating the cobweb-covered walls and the crumbling coffins that lined the shelves. It was like something out of a nightmare, a place where the dead seemed to whisper secrets from beyond the grave. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me, a soft, shuffling sound that made my heart race. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the darkness, but there was nothing there. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I hurried out of the mausoleum and back into the daylight, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. But as I made my way back to the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in the back of my mind. I decided to do some research when I got back home, hoping to uncover the truth about the mysterious graveyard I'd stumbled upon. But the more I dug, the more disturbing the truth became. It turned out that the area had a dark history, a history of murder and betrayal that stretched back for generations. There were stories of feuds between families, of lovers scorned, and of secrets buried in shallow graves. I realized then that I had stumbled upon something far more sinister than I had ever imagined. This wasn't just an abandoned graveyard, it was a place haunted by the ghosts of the past, where the sins of the past still lingered in the air. As I read more and more about the area's dark history, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had uncovered something best left buried. But it was too late, the truth was out there, and there was no going back. I returned to the wilderness several times in the following weeks, unable to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. But each time I visited the graveyard, I felt like I was being watched, like the spirits of the dead were waiting for me to uncover their secrets. In the end, I decided to leave the graveyard behind and try to forget about the horrors I had witnessed. I've always been fascinated by caves. There's something about the darkness and the mystery that draws me in, despite the inherent dangers. So when I heard about a remote cave system in the middle of nowhere, I knew I had to explore it. I packed my gear and set out early in the morning, eager to begin my adventure. As I made my way through the dense forest, I couldn't shake the feeling of excitement and anticipation building inside me. When I finally arrived at the entrance to the cave system, I was in awe of its grandeur. The gaping maw of the cave seemed to swallow me whole as I stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the darkness like a beacon. For hours, I wandered deeper and deeper into the cave, marveling at the rock formations and the strange, otherworldly beauty of my surroundings. But as I ventured further into the depths, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that began to creep over me. And then, without warning, disaster struck. As I passed through a narrow passage, I heard a loud rumbling sound from behind me. I turned to see the entrance to the cave collapsing in on itself, blocking my only way out. Panic surged through me as I realized I was trapped deep underground with no way to communicate with the outside world. My heart pounded in my chest as I struggled to think clearly, trying to come up with a plan to escape. But as I groped my way through the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to hold a lurking presence, every sound sending shivers down my spine. I pressed on, my footsteps echoing off the walls of the cave as I searched for another way out. But the deeper I went, the more disoriented I became, the passages twisting and turning in an endless maze of rock and darkness. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, I heard it, a low, guttural growl echoing through the caverns, sending a chill down my spine. I froze in terror, my mind racing as I tried to comprehend what could be making such a sound. I knew I had to keep moving, to find a way out of this nightmare. But with each step I took, the sense of dread grew stronger, the feeling of being watched more intense. I stumbled through the darkness, my heart pounding in my chest as I desperately searched for an escape. But no matter which way I turned, I seemed only to find more passages, more dead ends, more darkness closing in around me. And then, just when I thought I couldn't go on any longer, I saw it, a glimmer of light up ahead, faint but unmistakable. With renewed hope, I raced towards it, my footsteps echoing off the walls of the cave as I drew closer and closer to freedom. But as I reached the source of the light, my heart sank. It was only a dead end, a cruel trick of the darkness. I slumped to the ground in defeat, my hope draining away with each passing moment. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a shadowy figure lurking in the darkness, its eyes gleaming with malice. My blood ran cold as I realized I was now alone in the cave. Something sinister was stalking me from the shadows. With a surge of adrenaline, I scrambled to my feet and bolted in the opposite direction, my heart racing as I fled from my unseen pursuer. I knew I had to find a way out, to escape from this hellish labyrinth before it was too late. But no matter how fast I ran, the darkness seemed to swallow me whole, the passages twisting and turning in an endless maze of rock and despair. I felt like a rat in a maze, trapped with no way out, no hope of escape. And then, just when I thought all hope was lost, I saw it, a faint glimmer of light up ahead, growing brighter with each passing moment. With a renewed sense of determination, I raced towards it, my heart pounding in my chest as I drew closer and closer to freedom. And then, finally, I emerged from the darkness into the blinding light of day, blinking in disbelief as I took in my surroundings. I had made it out alive, escaped from the claustrophobic depths of the cave to the open air and the warmth of the sun. As I stumbled out into the sunlight, I vowed never to underestimate the dangers of the wilderness again. It was supposed to be a fun camping trip with my friends, a chance to escape the hustle and bustle of city life and immerse ourselves in the tranquility of nature. Little did we know, our adventure would take a dark turn that none of us could have anticipated. As we ventured deeper into the wilderness, we stumbled upon a remote hunting cabin nestled among the trees. It seemed like the perfect place to spend the night, shelter from the elements and a cozy fire to keep us warm. But as the sun began to set and the shadows lengthened, we couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the cabin. There was an eerie stillness in the air, and the silence seemed to press in on us from all sides. Despite our reservations, we decided to make ourselves at home, lighting a fire in the hearth and settling down for the night. But as darkness fell and the temperature dropped, the atmosphere inside the cabin grew increasingly tense. It wasn't long before we started hearing strange noises coming from the surrounding woods, rustling leaves, snapping twigs, and the occasional distant howl. We tried to convince ourselves that it was just the wind playing tricks on us, but deep down, we knew something wasn't right. As we huddled together for warmth, a sense of dread washed over us like a wave. We couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that there were eyes lurking in the darkness, watching our every move. And then, just as we were about to drift off to sleep, we heard it, a low, guttural growl emanating from somewhere outside the cabin. It sent a shiver down my spine, chilling me to the core with its primal intensity. We froze, our hearts pounding in our chests as we listened to the sound growing louder and closer with each passing moment. Whatever was out there, it was getting closer, and we knew we had to do something, anything, to protect ourselves. With trembling hands, we grabbed whatever makeshift weapons we could find, branches, rocks, anything that could be used to defend ourselves against whatever lurked outside. But deep down, we knew that we were no match for whatever awaited us in the darkness. As the growling grew louder, we braced ourselves for the worst, steeling our nerves for whatever horror awaited us on the other side of the cabin door. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the growling stopped, leaving us in a deafening silence that seemed to stretch on for an eternity. We waited, holding our breath and straining our ears for any sign of movement outside. But there was nothing, no footsteps, no rustling leaves, nothing to indicate that whatever had been stalking us was still out there. After what felt like an eternity, we mustered up the courage to peek outside, half expecting to come face to face with some unspeakable horror waiting to pounce on us from the shadows. But to our relief, there was nothing, just the empty expanse of the forest, shrouded in darkness and silence. We breathed a collective sigh of relief, grateful to have survived whatever had been lurking outside the cabin. But our sense of relief was short-lived, as we soon realized that our ordeal was far from over. As we searched the cabin for any signs of what had happened, we stumbled upon a hidden trapdoor in the floorboards, a dark, foreboding portal leading down into the depths of the earth. It was as if the cabin itself held dark secrets that were just waiting to be unearthed. With trepidation, we descended into the darkness below, our hearts pounding in our chests as we braced ourselves for whatever horrors awaited us in the depths. But what we found was beyond anything we could have imagined. The basement was filled with cages, crude, makeshift prisons designed to hold captive whatever unfortunate souls had stumbled upon the cabin before us. And as we explored further, we discovered evidence of unspeakable horrors, bloodstains on the walls, shackles bolted to the floor, and the remnants of some twisted ritual that sent chills down our spines. It was then that we realized the true nature of the cabin. It wasn't just a shelter for weary travelers, but a hunting ground for something far more sinister. And as we stood there in the darkness, surrounded by the remnants of its dark past, we knew that we had to get out, and fast. With trembling hands, we made our way back to the surface, our minds reeling with the horror of what we had seen. But as we emerged into the night air, we were met with an even greater terror, the sound of footsteps approaching from all sides, closing in on us with terrifying speed. We ran, our hearts pounding in our chests as we fled into the darkness, desperate to escape whatever horror awaited us in the forest. And as we disappeared into the night, leaving the cabin and its dark secrets behind us, We knew that we would never forget the horror of that fateful night in the woods. I was driving through the wilderness, just enjoying the scenery and taking in the sights. The road stretched out before me, winding its way through the trees and disappearing into the distance. But then, up ahead, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. A town, seemingly abandoned, sitting in the middle of nowhere. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to pull over and explore further. As I walked through the deserted streets, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled over me. There was something eerie about the town, something that didn't quite sit right. I wandered through the empty buildings, peering through dusty windows and trying to piece together the story of what had happened here. But the more I explored, the more I realized that something was seriously wrong. As I rounded a corner, I came face to face with a group of people, hostile-looking individuals who eyed me with suspicion and mistrust. I tried to strike up a conversation, but they were tight-lipped and evasive, refusing to answer my questions or tell me anything about the town. I started to feel like I was being watched, like there were eyes on me from every corner. I tried to brush it off and continue exploring, but the feeling of unease only grew stronger with each passing moment. As night fell, I realized I needed to find somewhere to stay. I approached one of the residents and asked if there was anywhere I could spend the night, but they just shook their head and turned away without saying a word. Feeling increasingly desperate, I wandered through the streets, searching for somewhere, anywhere, that I could find shelter for the night. But everywhere I went, the doors were locked and the windows were boarded up, as if the town was trying to keep me out. Finally, I stumbled upon a small, run-down motel at the edge of town. The owner eyed me warily as I approached, but he reluctantly agreed to let me stay for the night, warning me to keep my head down and stay out of trouble. As I settled into my room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong with this town. The air was thick with tension, and I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched from every corner. I tried to sleep, but every creak of the floorboards and every rustle of the wind outside seemed to echo through the room, keeping me awake and on edge. I tossed and turned, my mind racing with thoughts of what could be lurking outside my door. Finally, exhaustion got the better of me, and I drifted off into an uneasy sleep. But my rest was short-lived. I was awoken in the middle of the night by a loud banging on my door. Heart pounding, I stumbled out of bed and approached the door cautiously. Through the peephole, I saw a group of the town's residents, their faces twisted with anger and hostility. They demanded that I leave town immediately, warning me that if I didn't, I would suffer the consequences. I tried to reason with them, but they were beyond reasoning. Their minds seemed clouded with hatred and madness. With no other choice, I gathered my things and fled into the night, the sounds of their angry shouts echoing in my ears as I ran. I didn't stop until I was far away from that cursed town, my heart pounding and my breath coming in ragged gasps. As I caught my breath, I realized that I had narrowly escaped a fate worse than death. Whatever was going on in that town, it was something dark and sinister, something that I never wanted to experience again. And as I drove away, I vowed to never return, leaving the nightmare of that abandoned town far behind me. It all started innocently enough, just a weekend hiking trip to escape the hustle and bustle of city life. I packed my backpack with essentials, food, water, a map, and a compass, and set off into the wilderness, eager to explore the great outdoors. As I ventured deeper into the forest, the world around me seemed to fade away, replaced by the serene beauty of nature. The air was crisp and clean, the trees towering overhead, and the only sounds were the chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves. But as I trekked deeper into the wilderness, I stumbled upon something that sent chills down my spine, a clearing in the forest, hidden from view by a thick canopy of trees. And in the center of the clearing stood a group of people, dressed in dark robes and chanting in unison. At first, I thought it was just a group of hikers like myself, maybe practicing some kind of meditation or yoga. But as I watched from a distance, I realized that there was something off about them, something sinister and unsettling. Their voices rose and fell in a hypnotic rhythm, and their movements were slow and deliberate, as if they were in some kind of trance. And then, as if sensing my presence, they all turned as one and fixed their gaze on me, their eyes burning with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. I knew I had to get out of there, and fast. But as I turned to leave, I realized that I was surrounded on all sides by dense forest, with no clear path back to civilization. Panic began to rise within me, threatening to consume me whole. I tried to retrace my steps, but the trees seemed to shift and move, blocking my path and leading me deeper into the heart of the forest. It was as if the very forest itself was conspiring against me, trapping me in its clutches with no hope of escape. As I stumbled through the underbrush, my heart pounding in my chest, I could hear the chanting growing louder and louder behind me, echoing through the trees like a sinister drumbeat. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. Hidden among the trees was a makeshift campsite, littered with strange symbols and artifacts, candles, incense, and what looked like bones arranged in intricate patterns. It was as if I had stumbled upon the lair of some ancient cult, hidden from view by the dense foliage of the forest. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the chanting stopped, leaving me in a deafening silence that seemed to stretch on for an eternity. I waited, holding my breath and straining my ears for any sign of movement, but there was nothing, no sound, no movement, nothing to indicate that anyone was still out there. I knew I had to get out of there, and fast. With trembling hands, I gathered up my things and made a break for it, running as fast as I could through the trees, desperate to put as much distance between myself and the cult as possible. But no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that unseen eyes were following my every move, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. It was as if the forest itself had come alive, with every tree and bush hiding some unseen menace waiting to pounce. I pushed myself harder and harder, my lungs burning and my legs aching with exertion, but still, I couldn't seem to shake the feeling of dread that hung over me like a dark cloud. It was as if the very air around me was thick with malevolence, suffocating me with its oppressive weight. And then, just when I thought I couldn't go on any longer, I stumbled upon a trail, a faint, winding path that seemed to lead back to civilization. With renewed hope, I followed it, my heart pounding in my chest as I prayed for deliverance from whatever horrors lurked in the darkness behind me. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I emerged from the forest, blinking in the harsh light of the setting sun. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath and trembling with exhaustion, but alive, somehow, miraculously alive. As I lay there in the dirt, I couldn't help but wonder what had happened back in the forest, what kind of twisted rituals those cultists had been practicing, and what would have happened to me if I hadn't managed to escape. I was driving through the countryside when the storm hit. The rain was coming down in sheets, and I could barely see the road in front of me. Desperate for shelter, I scanned the horizon for any sign of civilization. That's when I saw it, a farmhouse, sitting alone in the middle of a field. It looked old and abandoned, but it was better than nothing. I pulled up to the house and ran inside, hoping to escape the worst of the storm. The inside of the farmhouse was dark and musty, with cobwebs hanging from the ceiling and dust covering every surface. I called out, but there was no response. It seemed like I was the only one there. I explored further, trying to find a dry place to sit and wait out the storm. But as I made my way through the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There were strange noises coming from the walls, scratching and scraping sounds that made my skin crawl. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. As I reached the top of the stairs, I froze. There, standing in the hallway, was a figure. It was tall and gaunt, with sunken eyes and a twisted smile that sent shivers down my spine. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure just stood there, watching me with a look of twisted amusement. I stumbled back, trying to put as much distance between myself and the figure as possible. But no matter where I went, it seemed to follow, always lurking just out of sight, waiting for me to let my guard down. I knew I had to get out of there, but the storm outside was still raging, and I had no idea how far I was from the nearest town. I was trapped, alone in the darkness with whatever was lurking in the shadows. I tried to find a way to defend myself, a weapon, a phone, anything that could help me fight back. But the farmhouse was empty, save for me and the figure that haunted its halls. Hours passed, and still the storm raged on. I huddled in a corner, trying to make myself as small as possible, praying for the sun to rise and chase away the darkness. But as the hours dragged on, I began to lose hope. It felt like I was trapped in a nightmare, with no way out and no one to help me. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard a sound, the distant rumble of an engine. Relief flooded through me as I realized help was finally on the way. I rushed to the window and peered outside, but what I saw made my blood run cold. There, parked in front of the farmhouse, was a car. And standing beside it, watching me with those same twisted eyes, was the figure. I knew then that I was truly alone, trapped in the farmhouse with whatever was lurking inside. But I refused to give up hope. I would find a way out, no matter what it took. With a renewed sense of determination, I set out to explore the farmhouse once more, searching for any sign of escape. But as I moved through the darkened halls, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I moved quickly, trying to stay one step ahead of whatever was lurking in the shadows. But no matter how fast I ran, it always seemed to be right behind me, just out of reach. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I found it, a door, hidden away in the back of the farmhouse. With a sense of desperation, I threw it open and stumbled outside, gasping for breath as the cool night air washed over me. But my relief was short-lived. Standing before me, blocking my path, was the figure. It smiled at me, its eyes glinting in the darkness, as if it knew something I didn't. I tried to run, but it was too late. The figure was upon me, its twisted hands reaching out to grab me. And as it closed in, I realized with horror that I was not the first to fall victim to whatever evil lurked within the farmhouse. But I refused to go down without a fight. With every ounce of strength I had left, I pushed back against the figure, determined to escape its clutches and make it out of the darkness alive. And as I struggled against the darkness, a voice whispered in my ear, a voice that sounded eerily familiar, as if it had been there all along, guiding me towards my fate. With a final burst of energy, I broke free from the figure's grasp and stumbled into the night, leaving the farmhouse and its horrors behind me for good. It was supposed to be a weekend of relaxation, just me, my tent, and the great outdoors. I had been looking forward to it for weeks, a chance to escape the stresses of everyday life and reconnect with nature. But as I set up camp in a remote clearing deep in the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet, devoid of the usual sounds of birdsong and rustling leaves. And as night fell and the darkness closed in around me, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled over me like a thick fog. But I brushed it off as just my imagination playing tricks on me, and settled down for the night, hoping that a good night's sleep would banish my fears once and for all. But as I drifted off into slumber, I was suddenly jolted awake by the sound of snapping twigs and heavy footsteps outside my tent. My heart pounding in my chest, I lay there in the darkness, listening intently as the footsteps drew closer and closer. And then, just when I thought I couldn't bear it any longer, they stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to stretch on for an eternity. I lay there, frozen in fear, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But there was nothing, no sound, no movement, nothing to indicate that anyone or anything was out there in the darkness. But just as I was beginning to relax and convince myself that it had all been a figment of my imagination, I heard it, a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down my spine. It was unlike anything I had ever heard before, primal and menacing, like the growl of some wild animal stalking its prey. I knew then that I was now alone in the woods, that there was something out there, something hungry and dangerous and very, very real. And as the growling grew louder and more insistent, I realized with a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach that I was its target. With trembling hands, I fumbled for my flashlight and switched it on, casting a feeble beam of light into the darkness outside. And what I saw there made my blood run cold, a pair of eyes, glowing with an otherworldly intensity, staring back at me from the shadows. I knew then that I had to get out of there, and fast. With adrenaline coursing through my veins, I tore open the flap of my tent and bolted into the night, running as fast as my legs would carry me, guided only by the beam of my flashlight and the sound of my pounding heart. But no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't seem to shake the feeling that I was being pursued, that unseen eyes were watching my every move, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And then, just when I thought I couldn't go on any longer, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. Hidden among the trees was a crude shack, its walls constructed from branches and its roof from tattered pieces of canvas. And standing in the doorway, illuminated by the beam of my flashlight, was the source of the growling, a man, or something that used to be a man, with wild eyes and a feral grin. I knew then that I had stumbled upon something truly terrifying, a wilderness cannibal, living off the land and hunting unsuspecting travelers like myself. And as he lunged towards me, his hands outstretched and his teeth bared in a hungry grin, I knew that my worst nightmares had come true. But I refused to go down without a fight. With a scream of terror, I turned and fled into the darkness, ducking and weaving between the trees as the cannibal pursued me with single-minded determination. And then, just when I thought all hope was lost, I saw it, a faint glow in the distance, the telltale sign of civilization. With renewed hope, I pushed myself harder and harder, my lungs burning and my legs aching with exertion. And then, just when I thought I couldn't go on any longer, I burst through the trees and stumbled into the clearing, gasping for breath and trembling with exhaustion. But I was safe, somehow, miraculously, safe. And as I collapsed to the ground, surrounded by the comforting glow of streetlights and the sounds of cars passing by, I knew that I would never venture into the wilderness again, not for all the world. It was supposed to be a routine road trip, just me driving south to visit family. But as I navigated the winding back roads, I soon realized that I had taken a wrong turn somewhere, and now I was hopelessly lost in the middle of nowhere. As I drove on, the landscape grew increasingly desolate, with nothing but empty fields stretching out in every direction. And then, just when I was beginning to despair of ever finding my way back to civilization, I spotted it, a small town nestled in the valley below. Relief flooded through me as I pulled into the town, hoping to find someone who could point me in the right direction. But as I drove through the silent streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the place. The buildings looked deserted, with boarded-up windows and peeling paint. And there was no sign of life anywhere, no cars parked on the streets, no people going about their business, nothing but eerie silence. But I brushed off my unease and continued on, hoping to find someone, anyone, who could help me. And then, just when I was beginning to lose hope, I spotted two figures standing on the sidewalk up ahead. Relief flooded through me as I pulled over and rolled down my window, calling out to them for help. But as they turned to face me, I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something about their appearance that sent alarm bells ringing in my head. Their clothes were tattered and dirty, their faces obscured by shadows. And there was something in their eyes, something cold and calculating, like they were sizing me up, deciding whether I was friend or foe. I tried to ignore my instincts and ask them for directions, but they just stared at me in silence, their eyes boring into mine. And then, just when I was about to give up and drive away, one of them spoke, a low, gravelly voice that sent shivers down my spine. He told me that I was in their town now, and that I wasn't welcome here. And then, before I could react, they both lunged towards my car, their hands reaching for the door handles. Panic surged through me as I slammed my foot down on the gas pedal, the tires screeching as I peeled out of there and sped away down the deserted streets. But no matter how fast I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, somewhere, watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. With trembling hands, I reached for my phone and dialed 911, hoping that someone, anyone, would answer and send help. But all I got was static, the call failing to connect as I drove further and further away from the town. I knew then that I was on my own, that if I wanted to get out of this alive, I would have to rely on my wits and my instincts alone. And so I drove on, my heart pounding in my chest, my eyes darting nervously from side to side as I searched for any sign of civilization. And then, just when I was about to give up hope, I spotted it, a sign for the highway, just up ahead. With renewed determination, I pushed down on the gas pedal and raced towards it, praying that I would make it out of this nightmare alive. And then, finally, mercifully, I was back on the highway, leaving the town and its inhabitants far behind me. But even as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for their next victim. But one thing was for sure, I would never forget my chilling encounter with those two creepy men, and I would never, ever return to that town again. We were on our way to the beach, my wife and I, eager to soak up the sun and feel the sand between our toes. But as we drove along the deserted highway, I realized that nature was calling and I needed to find a restroom, fast. Spotting a sign for a gas station up ahead, I veered off the road and pulled into the parking lot, grateful for the chance to relieve myself. As I made my way inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about this place. The air seemed heavy with an unspoken tension, and the few people milling about cast wary glances in my direction. Ignoring their stares, I hurried to the restroom and locked myself in a stall, eager to be done with my business and get back on the road. But just as I was about to finish up, I heard voices, low, murmuring voices, coming from the other side of the door. I strained to make out what they were saying, but their words were muffled and indistinct, like the whispers of ghosts echoing through the walls. Feeling a sudden sense of unease, I hurriedly washed my hands and made my way back out into the main part of the gas station. But as I emerged from the restroom, I froze in my tracks. Two men were standing there, blocking my path, their eyes fixed on my wife with an unsettling intensity. I felt a surge of protectiveness wash over me as I hurried over to her side, ready to confront these strangers and defend my wife if necessary. But before I could say anything, one of the men spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "Hey there, pretty lady," he said, his words oozing with a slimy charm that made my skin crawl. "What's a nice girl like you doing in a place like this?" I felt my wife tense beside me, her hand tightening around mine as she shot me a nervous glance. I could see the fear in her eyes, and it filled me with a cold, creeping dread. "We're just passing through," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady despite the rising panic in my chest. "We're on our way to the beach for a weekend getaway." The man's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I thought he might say something else. But then, to my relief, he simply shrugged and turned away, gesturing for his companion to follow him. "Suit yourselves," he muttered, his voice trailing off as they disappeared into the shadows of the gas station. And with a shudder of relief, my wife and I hurried back to our car, eager to put this unsettling encounter behind us. But as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that those men had been up to no good, that there was something sinister lurking beneath their smooth, polite facade. It was a sunny day, perfect for a hike through the wilderness. The air was crisp, and the birds were singing as I made my way along the winding trail. I had been hiking for hours, enjoying the solitude and the beauty of nature, when something caught my eye, a strange, metal door nestled into the side of a hill. Curiosity piqued, I made my way over to investigate, my heart pounding with excitement. Who would build a door out here, in the middle of nowhere? And what could possibly be hiding behind it? As I approached, I noticed that the door was slightly ajar, as if inviting me inside. With a sense of trepidation, I pushed it open and stepped into the darkness beyond. At first, I could see nothing but blackness, but as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I realized that I was standing in some sort of underground bunker. The air was stale and musty, and the walls were lined with shelves filled with canned goods and other supplies. But as I explored further, my excitement turned to horror, for scattered across the floor were the remnants of what looked like a struggle. There were torn clothes, and blood stains, and signs of a violent struggle. My heart pounding, I stumbled back, my mind racing with fear and confusion. What had happened here? And who, or what, was responsible? As I tried to make sense of the scene before me, I noticed something glinting in the corner, a small, silver object half buried in the dirt. With shaking hands, I reached out and picked it up, my fingers trembling as I realized what it was, a bullet casing, still warm to the touch. My mind reeled with horror as I realized the implications. Someone had been killed here, and whoever had done it was still out there, somewhere in the wilderness. With a sense of growing unease, I turned and fled, my heart pounding with fear. But as I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone, or something, was lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike. And as I finally emerged from the bunker and back into the daylight, I vowed never to return to that cursed place again. For days afterwards, I couldn't shake the memory of what I had seen, the blood stains, the bullet casing, the sense of fear and dread that had gripped me in that dark, underground bunker. And though I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination running wild, I knew deep down that something sinister had happened there, something that I would never be able to forget. I was hiking alone in the wilderness, enjoying the solitude and the beauty of nature. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, it was the perfect day for a hike. But as I made my way deeper into the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to brush it off as paranoia, but the feeling only grew stronger with each passing moment. I quickened my pace, hoping to put some distance between myself and whatever unseen presence was lurking in the shadows. But no matter how fast I ran, it always felt like it was right behind me, just out of sight. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. There was something out there, watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I tried to stay calm, to think logically about what to do next. But as the hours passed and the feeling of dread continued to grow, I knew I had to get out of there, and fast. I picked up my pace, trying to find my way back to the trailhead. But the forest seemed to stretch on endlessly in every direction, and no matter which way I turned, I couldn't find my way out. That's when I heard it, the sound of footsteps echoing through the trees. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, as I realized I was now alone in the forest. I tried to stay quiet, to listen for any sign of who, or what, was approaching. But the footsteps grew closer and closer, until they were almost upon me. With a surge of adrenaline, I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush in a blind panic. But no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was right behind me, closing in with every passing moment. I pushed myself harder, desperate to put as much distance between myself and whatever was chasing me. But no matter how fast I ran, it always felt like it was right behind me, just out of reach. I stumbled and fell, crashing to the ground with a thud that echoed through the forest. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the pain in my knees as I pushed myself to keep running. But as I looked up, I froze. There, standing before me, was my stalker. It was someone I knew, someone I trusted, but their eyes were cold and empty, devoid of any humanity. I tried to speak, to ask them why they were doing this, but no words came out. I could only stare in horror as they advanced towards me, their hands outstretched, reaching for me with a look of malicious intent. I knew I had to do something, anything, to protect myself. With a surge of adrenaline, I lashed out, striking my stalker with all the force I could muster. They stumbled back, caught off guard by my sudden attack. And in that moment of confusion, I turned and ran, pushing myself harder than I ever thought possible. I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of the trailhead, where I collapsed in exhaustion, gasping for breath as tears streamed down my face. I knew I had to get help, to warn others about what had happened to me. With trembling hands, I reached for my phone and dialed 911, recounting my terrifying ordeal to the dispatcher. They assured me that help was on the way and instructed me to stay put until they arrived. I sat there on the ground, shivering with fear and exhaustion, waiting for the sound of approaching sirens. Minutes felt like hours as I anxiously scanned the surrounding forest, half expecting my stalker to emerge from the shadows at any moment. Finally, the sound of an approaching police car broke through the silence, and I let out a shaky sigh of relief. The officers rushed to my side, their expressions filled with concern as they helped me to my feet and guided me towards their vehicle. As we drove away from the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in the pit of my stomach. I couldn't stop thinking about my stalker, about how they had been someone I knew and trusted, and yet they had turned on me in such a terrifying way. The police took my statement and assured me that they would do everything in their power to apprehend my stalker and ensure that they faced justice for their actions. But even as they spoke, I couldn't shake the feeling of paranoia that consumed me. In the days that followed, I struggled to sleep, haunted by nightmares of being pursued through the forest by my stalker. Every sound outside my window sent my heart racing, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see their menacing figure lurking in the shadows. But slowly, with the support of friends and family, I began to regain a sense of normalcy. I avoided going into the wilderness alone, sticking to well-traveled trails and populated areas whenever I ventured outdoors. Months passed, and eventually, the memories of that terrifying day began to fade. I never did find out who my stalker was or why they had targeted me, but I tried not to dwell on the unanswered questions. Instead, I focused on moving forward with my life, grateful for each day that passed without incident. I moved to this town in the middle of nowhere about a month ago. It seemed like a peaceful place, far away from the hustle and bustle of city life. The people were friendly enough, always waving hello as I passed by. But there was something off about the neighbors. They were always whispering to each other, casting furtive glances in my direction whenever I walked by. At first, I thought maybe they were just shy or didn't like outsiders. But the longer I lived here, the more I began to suspect that there was something more sinister going on. One night, I was awoken by the sound of footsteps outside my window. I peered out into the darkness, expecting to see a stray animal or maybe even a prowler. But what I saw chilled me to the bone. It was my neighbors, standing in a circle in the middle of the street. They were dressed in dark robes, their faces obscured by hoods. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the way they moved, the way they seemed to be swaying in unison, sent a shiver down my spine. I wanted to call the police to report what I was seeing, but something held me back, a nagging feeling that if I got involved, I would become their next target. So I watched from the safety of my window, feeling a growing sense of dread as the minutes stretched on. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they vanished into the night, leaving me alone in the darkness. I tried to tell myself that it was just a dream, a trick of the mind brought on by stress or a lack of sleep. But deep down, I knew that what I had witnessed was all too real. The next day, I decided to do some digging, to find out who these people were and what they were up to. But the more I asked around, the more elusive the answers became. No one seemed to know much about my neighbors, where they came from, what they did for a living, or even their names. It was like they didn't exist, like they were ghosts haunting the edges of our town. I tried to put it out of my mind, to go about my daily routine as if nothing had happened. But every time I saw them, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And then, one night, it happened. I was walking home from the grocery store when I felt someone grab me from behind. I struggled, trying to break free, but their grip was like iron. They dragged me into an alleyway, their face hidden behind a mask. I could hear them breathing heavily, their breath hot against my neck as they whispered in my ear. They told me to leave, to get out of town and never come back. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone, leaving me alone in the darkness once more. I stumbled home, shaken and terrified, unsure of what to do next. But deep down, I knew that I couldn't stay, that if I did, I would always be looking over my shoulder, waiting for my neighbors to strike again. So I packed my bags and left town, never looking back. And as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was leaving behind something unspeakably evil, something that would haunt me for the rest of my days. I was driving through the desert, the sun beating down on my car as I pressed on through the barren landscape. It was hot, the air shimmering with heat waves as far as the eye could see. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I glanced around nervously, but there was nothing but sand and scrub as far as the eye could see. Still, the feeling persisted, crawling up my spine like a cold hand. And then, out of nowhere, I saw it, another car, parked on the side of the road. It was old and rusted, its paint peeling in the relentless sun. I slowed down as I approached, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, that I should turn around and get out of there as fast as I could. But curiosity got the better of me, and I pulled up alongside the abandoned car. I peered inside, but it was empty. No sign of anyone or anything. Just as I was about to drive away, I heard it, a sound coming from the back seat of the car. It was faint at first, but it grew louder and louder until it filled the air with a chilling cacophony. I froze, my blood turning to ice as I realized what it was, laughter. But not just any laughter, the laughter of a child. I didn't waste any time. I slammed my foot on the gas and sped away as fast as I could, the laughter echoing in my ears long after I left the abandoned car behind. I tried to put it out of my mind, to focus on the road ahead. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me like a dark cloud. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, I saw it, another car, barreling towards me from out of nowhere. I swerved to avoid it, my heart pounding in my chest as I narrowly avoided a collision. But as the car passed, I caught a glimpse of the driver, or rather, what was left of them. Their face was twisted in a grotesque grin, their eyes empty and lifeless as they stared straight ahead. I tried to shake it off, to tell myself that it was just a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew that something was terribly wrong, that I was in real danger. I pressed on, driving faster and faster as the desert stretched out before me like an endless sea of sand. But no matter how fast I drove, the other car was always right behind me, its headlights shining like twin beacons in the darkness. I was running out of options, and time. I knew I had to do something, anything, to escape the nightmare that was closing in around me. And then, just when I thought all hope was lost, I saw it, a sign for a gas station up ahead. I pushed my car to its limits, racing towards the safety of civilization as fast as I could. I pulled into the gas station, my heart pounding in my chest as I stumbled out of the car. I tried to tell the attendant what had happened, but my words came out in a jumble of fear and panic. But the attendant just looked at me like I was crazy, shaking his head as he turned away. And then, just like that, it was over. The other car was gone, leaving me alone in the darkness once more. I tried to put it out of my mind, to tell myself that it was just a hallucination brought on by the heat and exhaustion. But deep down, I knew that what I had seen was all too real, and that it would haunt me for the rest of my days.